Hey everybody, welcome to another review session for AP World History Modern. Y'all know me, I'm Mason Logereau, but now you're wondering, wait, who are these other two people that are with me? And I'll tell you in 1 second. All right, so yesterday y'all wrote a DBQ. Hopefully it went well for you. Hopefully the timing worked out pretty good. But today what I want to do is just kind of go over each point in the rubric and talk about possible ways that you could have answered it in your DBQ. But then I thought, you know what, I need some help. So I called on two people that are experts in all of this, and those are sitting next to me virtually, I guess, here in these windows. So first we have Jody Eastberg. Jody, how are you?
Doing great, thank you, Mason.
Good. So Jody is a professor of world history who specializes in British-Chinese relations at Alverno College in Milwaukee. But most importantly, she is the chief reader for the AP reading for world history. And I'll explain what that means in just a second. But basically, she's kind of in charge of how the AP tests get graded. And then we also have Bill Ziegler. Bill, how are you?
Great, thanks, Mason.
So Bill's coming to us from San Diego, California. He is a AP World History teacher there. In fact, he was one of the original AP World History teachers. He's been teaching this course since the beginning. Not the beginning of world history, the beginning of the course in 2001, or you said actually 1999, right?
1990, yeah.
So Bill is the assistant chief reader for the reading. So the way this works, I'll tell you from my perspective as a reader, someone who's graded tests for the last several years. The College Board gets teachers from all over the country together, usually in one central location. There's hundreds of teachers. They're sitting in a convention center ballroom, and we do nothing but grade tests for 8 hours a day for about 8 days straight. I know it sounds really terrible and awful, but actually, I really enjoy it. It's fun to go travel. It's fun to meet other world history teachers. My wife has started calling it History Nerd Summer Camp, which it totally is, because I made friends and I get to see them once a year and all of that. But I wanted to get that perspective, but then I would like Jody and Bill to kind of jump in and talk about from their perspective, because they're kind of the leadership of the reading, what goes on behind the scenes.
Well, again, thanks for having us, Mason. Behind the scenes, wow, Bill. We are already working, we work year round to prepare for the reading. And so there's a lot of preparation that goes into making sure that everybody's on standard, that everybody's comfortable. And as you mentioned, we work hard to create a really positive climate and atmosphere for the read, because we really want to make sure that every student who has their exam reviewed by wonderful, experienced teachers and professors from really around the world, that every student's work is evaluated in the same way, and that everybody has the same thing in mind, which is the success of students. So you're right that it is, I appreciate your wife's comments, it is it sounds kind of weird and kind of horrible, but it's actually something I really look forward to each year.
Yeah. It's like, so for what I do is I often work with other leadership and develop samples. As Jody said, we want to make sure that everybody is on standard, and making sure that every single exam, we always think about that there's a student behind every test. We want to make sure that every single one of them gets a good read. So we provide samples, we give training materials, we do everything to make sure that people know all the different ways to apply the scoring guide, and to make sure that every student that is taking the exam is given every opportunity to succeed. We'll say it multiple times tonight that our job is to make sure that you get as many points as you can with the essay that you've written. And every reader is there looking at the samples, looking at the scoring guide to make sure that we're giving you every opportunity to succeed.
Excellent. Thank you all so much. And then, like I said, usually we get together in one central location. Obviously, this year that's not going to happen. So teachers are going to be grading those online at their homes all over the country. All right, but let's get into what y'all wanted to hear about today, which was last night's DBQ. One more thing before we do that. I was asked to talk about TikTok Then I had to Google what TikTok was, but then I learned. And apparently, a lot of you know about it and use it. But the College Board is wanting y'all to share any ideas of how you're reviewing for the exam on TikTok. So if you could please, over the next couple of days, please make a quick video. Tell us about how things are going at home with trying to study for the AP test. And if you could, mark the hashtag AP review or hashtag history, because we would love to know what's going on. And the College Board is going to share some of those on their Instagram and Twitter feeds. And yes, I know I realize I sound like a really old man trying to talk about TikTok. That's how I feel right now. Okay, so yeah, but I did my job. I talked about TikTok. All right, let's get on to the points of the rubric. So what I've done here is I've kind of written out some of my thoughts, and I'm also going to have kind of Bill and Jody chime in on what they see on each of the different points of the rubric. Now, of course, y'all know that it's a 10-point rubric this year, but all the elements of the older rubric, the one you've been learning all year, all the elements are still there, just some of the point values changed around. But let's start with what most people consider kind of the most important part of your essay and the most important point on the rubric, and that is your thesis statement. As you know, and we have talked about this over the last couple of weeks, Smith has talked about it over the last couple of weeks, you've got to make sure you're making a historical claim. Now, ideally, you would want to try and have 2 historical claims in your thesis statement. I think that works really well. It gives a nice little flow to the rest of your essay. But you've got to be specific. Okay, give some specific historical claims. Don't just put political causes or social causes or something like that. I gave you one example here. Don't just write for this DBQ, oh yeah, responses were similar all across Africa and Asia. 1, they weren't really similar all across Africa and Asia. 2, that's extremely broad. Okay, that's not really a historical claim. Instead, for your thesis statements, you want to think about what are the categories, what are the themes you kind of notice throughout the documents. And if you remember yesterday's DBQ, of those 5 documents, a couple of them talked about military force, a couple of them talked about using diplomacy as well in response to state expansion. So those are 2 possible thesis statements. But Jody and Bill, what are some other ways that you could write a thesis statement for this DBQ?
Well, Mason, I think one thing that we have to make sure that we're looking at is make sure you're answering the question, whatever the question is. And so for me, I always look at, if we're looking at what the prompt is saying, it's asking students to look at how Indigenous people's reactions to state expansion. To me, those are the 3 parts. You've got to be able to talk about the actor, which are Indigenous people. You have to talk about their action, their reactions, and how they believed about state expansion. So getting into and looking at those 3 portions, I think, are going to be really key. And you've got to make a single argument. It'd be great if it was in the thesis statement, but as long as you're giving me like a topic sentence in a paragraph that could be supported with evidence, that could be part of the argument also. So having a strong thesis in that intro is going to be really key. That's where we make our map. That's where we set our guidelines to the reader as to what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. So placing it in the introduction is going to be really nice. Like what you've got up here on the screen, Mason, having something where they're talking about in what way, how or why, that's going to give me my line of reasoning. And that's important.
Yeah, not only add that, really looking at categories of analysis like you've demonstrated here. So it's really helpful that you have a line of reasoning that's associated with military force, with diplomatic channels. Those are your categories of analysis. So as someone who's scoring this exam, I know where you're headed. I know where your analysis is headed.
Yeah, I like that y'all both brought up that idea of like where you're headed in your essay or your roadmap, because it really does help the readers. I mean, if you can lay out that clear roadmap, then when I'm reading your body paragraphs later and I see that evidence, I can, it clues me back to the thesis statement as well. Now, I put on here, you need to make sure your thesis is in your intro or your conclusion, because this is the one point of the rubric that has to be in a certain spot in your essay. But I've always kind of told my students, make sure you put it in your intro and your conclusion. So Jody, why is that important to maybe have that in your intro and your conclusion?
Well, I think it's just good practice. So first of all, if we take a step back and think about what this exam is really evaluating, it's evaluating whether or not students can demonstrate the skills of a historian. And so a historian really is doing persuasive writing. That's the type of writing we do as historians. And so if you're trying to persuade someone, you really should lay out your argument and let them know what you're trying to do. So in this case, it's also a really good idea because when we're scoring these exams, we know what they are. They're a draft, right? You're coming in, you're seeing the question for the first time, you're seeing the documents for the first time, and you're putting a draft together, a first draft. So for my students in my college history courses, if this were a paper or an essay, I might ask them to revise at a certain point, but you don't have that luxury of revision. And so if you train yourself to really try to do your thesis in the beginning and at the end, I know just for myself in my own writing, I become much more clear about my argument as I go through the essay. So you might actually find yourself stating your thesis even more clearly for the reader by the end point of your essay. So, and then it also just mirrors historical writing. So again, we lay out our argument at the beginning and then we summarize our argument at the end. That's the way historians write.
Yeah, I like that idea too. But as you're writing, your argument starts to get stronger as well. And I sometimes think of like that hamster that's running around the wheel in my brain. It starts to get moving after I keep writing for a while. So you're right. If you put that thesis in the conclusion, it's going to be stronger than it is in the intro. And then, the other thing we need to consider also, guys, is remember that when we're talking about getting points in the rubric, if you try the thesis once in the intro and it doesn't work real well, if you have it in your conclusion and it's better, then you can still get the point, even if you didn't do so well in the introduction.
Yeah, you would definitely want to do it in the intro because, of course, sometimes you run out of time. So yeah. I really encourage you to, do your best for that first paragraph, give yourself another shot at it at the end.
Exactly. All right, so let's think about what else should be in the introduction, and that is contextualization. Actually, let me back up. Should contextualization be in the introduction? Is that the best place for it, do y'all think?
I'll answer that. Again, if we're thinking about the skills of the historian, usually what we're doing with context is trying to set up like what our assumptions are or the situation in which the event that we're talking about is happening. So it's really important actually for historians to set context. And I think that, thinking about the context at the beginning of an essay can be helpful in shaping your argument, for example. I don't know, Bill, do you have things that you teach your students about that?
Yeah, for my students, I ask them to kind of consider the argument that you're making and the prompt that's there. So for example, in this specific prompt, there are terms that are used specifically in the prompt that could lead you to understanding greater context. So for example, the phrases indigenous peoples. So there's a reason why we use that phrase. So what do you know about indigenous peoples and what do you know about state expansion? This specific essay is taking place in the 19th century. So what type of state expansion was taking place that may have changed what indigenous people or people of a particular area may have felt? What was going on? And what type of state expansion? These are all things that you could look at as a way of building up your context. Where was it taking place? Who was involved? What were the events that were happening? All these things are kind of leading up to having a sense of the context of the argument that you're trying to create, which is about indigenous people's reactions.
And I like that you brought up that it needs to be related to, of course, the topics of the prompt specifically, because I've seen essays from students before where it's just, here's the general history of the world up until this point, right? Or here's the history of all indigenous people in Africa and Asia. And that's not really what context is supposed to be.
Right. It does necessarily have to be connected to the prompt. you all know this. You've heard this from your teachers multiple times, but the prompt is supreme. It's the thing that you have to be thinking about and you have to be responding to from the very beginning of the essay all the way to the end. And if it's not connecting back to that supreme idea, that ultimate idea of people's reactions to state expansion, then it's not helpful for your essay.
And I agree, like, I really like the ones that you've pulled out here, Mason, with industrialization. So how does, think about it, how does industrialization help to set context for these indigenous responses? So the type of raw materials that were desired, or the type of military strength that certain peoples had at this time, does help to set context for what these paths to resistance looked like. So we're trying to get a handle at how much can you see what the context, what the big picture is that's happening at the time that influences what we're trying to understand with the prompt.
Right. And then, like we've been saying, it's got to be connected to the prompt, directly related to the prompt. So I put a couple of ideas, topics to also avoid. These were topics I thought I could imagine students might try and write about this, like for example, the Atlantic revolutions, the United States, Haiti, and the South American revolutions, which, by the way, were in this time period because the prompt starts in 1750. So you might think, okay, well, that was happening during the time period, but I don't know that directly relates to this prompt, and really doesn't relate to the documents also when you look at them, because none of the documents are from the Americas at all. So just make sure that whatever you're talking about has a direct relationship to the topic of the prompt. And remember that example I used, and I think it was a couple of weeks ago in a video where I said, think about on a TV show when you see those scenes from previously on another television, from older episodes. Everything in the previously on directly relates to something that's going to happen that night. Okay. In fact, sometimes it kind of gets spoiled because you might see this previously on scene from an episode 2 years earlier, and there shows a character that you haven't seen in forever. Well, why are they showing it on previously on? Oh yeah, because that person's about to show up tonight on this episode. So it's directly related to the topic of the prompt. And then also, I guess, Bill and Jody, I know that if you look at the rubric that students have, contextualization can really occur before, during, or after the time period. But is there a suggestion y'all would make on like which of those would be best? Because I always tell my students to write before the time period. It seems easier, but do y'all have any thoughts?
I like the before the time period. The way I look at it is it's like a framing device. You're using this idea like a funnel. It's starting out, these are all the big things that are happening, and it's leading down to the thesis that you're creating. And so they're connected and they're kind of pulled together. And I like that idea that these are all the events or things that are happening in the world that may have led to these kind of reactions and these changes that are happening in the world.
Yeah, I agree. To reiterate, I mean, each of the ways that you've outlined is an appropriate way to do contextualization. And so the student should really go with what they know first. But if you're, again, practicing, the way I like to think of it is kind of like what Bill said, what led up to this moment. So the only thing I'd add is that if you know a lot about what's happening, let's say in the mid-19th century, for this question, talk about that. Don't be too literal to say it has to happen before whatever the time period is that was outlined in the question. We're really just looking for, can you understand what's come before to set context for this event, what's happening around whatever the thing is happening, or this series of documents, what does it tell us about what happens next?
Right. So there, you've got contextualization, you got thesis statement. You can put both those in your introduction and you've already got 2 points. So even that first opening paragraph is extremely important because that can get you 2 points right off the bat. All right. So now when I go through the documents, now when I was trying to put this PowerPoint together, I was trying to figure out a way to squeeze in the documents into the screen and it really wasn't working. So if you need to, you can pause the video and go back and download those documents from last night if you've forgotten what they look like. So if you want to take the second now, pause, and come back to us, you can certainly do that. But it might be a good idea to have the documents in front of you, either on paper, like I do, or in a different window. So for each of the documents, the biggest thing I put on the beginning of each slide is, guys, read the sourcing line. That is the first thing to read. And I know that Smith and I have both talked about that the last couple of weeks, but you've got to read that sourcing line, because most of the time, you're not going to recognize the author of the document. It's rare that you see a document from a really famous person. You're like, oh yeah, definitely, I know everything about them. So you need to make sure you're reading that sourcing line so you can figure out where they're writing from, when they're writing from, sometimes the topic as well. Okay. So for this first document, we have a West African political leader, Prempeh I. Now, if you don't know anything about him specifically, that's okay. Okay, you're not expected to know a whole lot about him necessarily, but you do know the situation. You do know that European countries are expanding their territory and control in Africa. And here he is trying to resist a takeover by the British. So Jody and Bill, what kind of jumped out to y'all in this document that you thought, oh, this would be a great way for students to be able to use this document?
Well, for me, at the very beginning, it comes across as extremely diplomatic. Here's a guy that is probably under lots of military pressure from the outside, and yet his letter is extremely polite, very connected. I mean, he's definitely somebody who sees himself as a peer to who he is writing to, and he's very comfortable with it. And I think that is something that you can really get at for this document on a really good surface level discussion, is that it's a very polite no. We're not interested, thank you very much. But I want people to focus in on that one word. He uses one specific word within the document. And I really talk to my kids about looking at parsing the terms, the words that are used, and he uses the word never. Now that's a big challenge. He's challenging the British government. He's telling them never, we will never do this, which also says that there's a lot of force. He's not just saying that politely, but he's also saying, I'm willing to send in military force. I'm willing to do other things to be able to keep my country alive. And I think that's more of a nuanced, more of a detailed look at this particular document.
Yeah, I completely agree. And you have a good interpretation of this document. It clearly shows the diplomatic approach that you're arguing with your thesis statement. And so just a couple things to remember for students is that try to summarize or not summarize, but record your thoughts about what the document is saying, because that will get you points. And then really think about what Bill is saying about pulling out specific parts of the document that are helping to forward your argument. Now, I'll give Bill some kudos, and we'll be talking about this later, but later on, I'm hoping when we talk about the final point on the rubric, that we talk about nuance. And I think what Bill's just done is shown us an example of nuance, because that difference between saying, no, thank you, and never would show me a student is really being nuanced in their understanding of this document. The context of this is that the Ashanti have already been in conflict with Europeans up until this point. Again, you don't necessarily know that as a student, but what came across to me from the document is real confidence. And we know that West Africa has a lot of resources, has a lot of great history that you've learned about. And so bringing that knowledge into your interpretation of this document would be great.
And so Jody, that kind of brings us into the sourcing of it, because guys, remember that this year you need to source 2 documents. Okay, you can get 2 points for that, preferably 3, but we'll talk about that later. And so that would be a good idea there, right? For historical situation of this document. Can they talk about the history of West Africa? Would that work?
I think definitely. I think it provides some context that there's been ongoing resistance, right? So you're understanding the source that this isn't the first time that this conversation has been had with the Europeans in this region. So that would be one thing. Also letting us know that this is a resource-rich area, and that that helps you to understand maybe the audience that they're speaking to, and also the confidence from which they're coming as an author. So those would be two. And then also the position, I think Bill's kind of given some hints towards sourcing there as well, that you have one leader speaking to, you have the leader of the region speaking to the British government and purposely referencing who he would consider to be his peer, the Queen of England, right? So, again, just watching the words, watching how they're using language can help with sourcing here.
And I noticed as you were talking to, think about sourcing, we always tell students, all right, point of view, purpose, audience, historical situation, but those bleed into each other a lot. It's not that you have to only stick to historical situation and you're not allowed to talk about purpose at all, right? Because you get in a couple sentences, you could hit almost a little bit on a couple of those for sure.
Absolutely.
But then you said earlier, you're talking about like resources in West Africa. Can I just write Mansa Musa in gold and call it a day, or do I need to connect it to what's happening here?
You definitely need to connect something like that to what's happening here.
All right, so let's go on to the next document. This was from Korea. We had a Korean group that is trying to oppose Japanese occupation. So I know for a lot of students, they were thinking state expansion. They were thinking European countries, maybe thinking the United States as well. Let's also not forget that the Japanese are doing this in East Asia as they became industrialized as well. And so, again, you look at the sourcing line, you go, okay, wait a minute. This is a very traditional Korean organization. They're Neo-Confucianists. We know Neo-Confucianism has been around in Korea for a long time, big opposition to foreigners. And we know that they're writing to not just soldiers in Korea, but to all Korean civilians. So what did y'all take away from this document? How could a student use this one?
Well, I think as Mason already pointed out to y'all that reading the source line and getting connected into that is key to this particular document. Once you have that, the rest of it just kind of flows right outward. If you've got that information from the sourcing line and you've got a traditional Korean organization opposing foreigners, that immediately kind of sets up the rest of the document. So I think if you look at that, I think at a nice surface level read, they're talking about nationalism, and they're talking about let's get together and we can fight together, and this is very nationalistic. But if we want to get deeper into it, you also need to realize that there's kind of almost a dissension or civil war or something that's going on, not a real outbreak, but they're not unified, and they're trying to pull in this unity together. And I think you can use something like that as a way of being able to argue how they're resisting, that there's even a debate within Korean society as to how you should resist. And this gets into a very different way of looking at this particular document than just to simply say it's all about nationalism. You can get into more of that there are changes. There are changes that are happening in Korea due to what's taking place.
Jody, did you have thoughts?
Sure. I agree with Bill, and I agree with what you have here. I think the other thing to think about is here's a place where maybe audience can also help you with your interpretation and really paying attention to that source line. So if the audience is soldiers, you can think about where does that fit within your argument. And while we're going through and kind of summarizing the documents, I just want to keep hitting that not only should you know what the source line says, should you know what the document says, but you're really trying to deploy these documents in support of an argument. And so in this case, you have that they're calling for military opposition. And so this helps you to push forward that argument you're making about military resistance.
Yeah, for sure. And we're going to see that again when we get to document 3. here in a second. You also said military opposition. But Bill, I did appreciate what you said too about how the pieces start to fall into place as you start doing that deeper reading. Because you look at this one, and I know students have done this in the past, they see something like the Tonghawk, and they're going, wait a minute, we never talked about this. Who are these people? We've never talked about this. And look, I'll tell you right now, I never mentioned this group ever in my class this year. I'm 99% positive it's nowhere in the textbook, right? But still, even if you don't know anything about them, as you start to look at that sourcing line, and y'all pay attention to the little, star at the bottom, that's important also, you can start to see that idea of nationalism begin to creep into the document. And then, Bill, like you said, it does start to sort of fall into place there.
Well, and Mason, I'd like to point out too, if you as students will just start looking at, again, I've said it with the first one, just looking at some of the language. If I look at the verbs that it uses in that first sentence, it starts off with exterminate, and then it goes to check, then restore, and then secure. I mean, to me, they're trying to say, this is how we're going to make our lives better. We'll exterminate, we'll check, we'll restore, and then secure. Everything is going to be wonderful. And it will kind of help you give a flow for the reading of the document and for your essay.
Yep. Excellent point. Thank you so much. All right, so let's go on to the next document. And that was the painting that you saw. Now, remember, there will be at least one visual document on your DBQ for this test. It might be a painting or a picture. It could be a chart or graph, but be something that's does not have text. All right. And in this one, we have a very famous battle of Adwa in Ethiopia. This was in Ethiopian history, a major turning point, defeat of the Italians. Again, you don't need to know a ton about the battle itself, though. I actually brought this up in class this year, but only because I had a student from Ethiopia who told me a lot about it and what an important moment it was in Ethiopian history. So again, you don't need to know about the battle itself, though, before you start looking at this document. You can see from the sourcing that it was an Ethiopian victory. By looking at the painting, you can tell that it's probably there to commemorate the event because it was a big victory. And again, we're starting to see military pushback to state expansion. Bill, what did you notice when you saw this, when you looked at this document?
I really like this painting. I mean, it has a lot of really cool things going on. If you start off with the sourcing line, look at the fact that it is an Ethiopian painting. That should automatically get you a sense of point of view, that they're coming directly from an Ethiopian perspective. This is not a European, Italian perspective. This is an Ethiopian. That should immediately give you a sense of what's going on with the painting. And then I love the fact that all these Ethiopians have modern military weapons. So if you go back to your context that you set up at the beginning of Industrial Revolution, this fits perfectly into the context that you developed of the Industrial Revolution. And yet, the one thing that I think really stands out for me in this painting is that even though there are these modern weapons and all this stuff that's going on, you can find many traditional practices within the painting. So in the upper right-hand corner, there's a saint. If you look over in the upper left-hand corner, there's a guy sitting in a chair with an umbrella over him. There's another umbrella with a guy underneath it in the bottom left-hand corner, and another one in the middle bottom. So you see all these very traditional things that are going on at the same time that you have this very modern idea. So it's on a really surface level read, we've got the idea that we've got this resistance, we've got military force, but look at all the cool things that are going on in this painting if we just dare to look at some of the things that are there. And don't forget the sourcing line. It's an Ethiopian painting.
It's great. I completely concur. I love this document. I think it's it's intended to be this celebration of an incredibly important moment in the nation's history, and it's recording as much in as much detail as it can about what's the story of this battle? What do they account for their successes? Certainly it's through the military tactics, but as Bill's pointing out, there's also the history and the power and the political power and the religious power of the nation that's pushing this battle forward. And so it's all captured in this image. And I really like to, when I saw this document and I was reading through it for the first time, I thought to myself, oh, this is great, because right now I can do something that's sort of nuanced with my argument. Not only can I make an argument, let's say, about military might, but with this document, I can connect it to one of the documents that was about diplomacy, the Ashanti document that came before. And I can talk about powerful African resistance to European power using both of those documents. So, you know, I think it's a really exciting document to work with.
So Jody, that's an interesting point you brought up, because you said if you were going to, you put them together, you kind of use document 1 and document 3 together to make an argument. Because when I first look at the documents, I see document 2 is about rah, rah, rah for the military. Document 3 is about a major battle. So I was putting those together in my brain. I mean, but either way could work, huh? What would you say there?
Well, I think making sure that you're making this argument, you know, based on what you've created your analysis around, which are historical categories, right? Like, so these categories of military resistance and diplomatic resistance. So I think if that's the direction you're going in, you might not, you know, you'd want to talk about the different documents that show diplomatic resistance together and then the documents that show military resistance together. But I guess what I'm saying is that there are other forms of argumentation and helping us to understand what you know, which is that you might, after this, make a comment that you notice that, you know, throughout North and West Africa, that there are African states that are resisting European power. And that, again, kind of goes to this idea of a nuanced argument, that you're seeing the connections between not just categories of analysis like militarism and diplomacy, but you're also seeing that there's something happening to resist European power in general. And that might be compared to how people in East Asia are resisting power. It's a little bit dangerous to do a geographic comparison. That can fall apart really easily. So I don't actually recommend that. What I do recommend, which is what's being demonstrated here, which is arguments around categories of historical analysis. But I do think it shows us a little deeper level thinking if you're able to argue against something, you know, because it's very typical for people to fall into some kind of lazy thinking that like all of this was inevitable because of European industrialization and industrial military strength. But it's not, of course. And we have these two documents that are showing us a different kind of story than might be traditionally told. That's what excites me about being a historian, frankly.
No, it's great. No,
arguing against people in their arguments. So maybe ignore me. This is where I had to bring Bill as assistant chief reader because he's my minder, and he lets me know when I'm getting too excited and too nerdy about things. So.
No, but I think you bring up an excellent point, because a lot of times I've heard the DBQ compared to a jigsaw puzzle, and people say, "Oh, you put the pieces together and all that," and I get that. I get that analogy, but a jigsaw puzzle, there's only one way to put the pieces together. A DBQ, there certainly is not. There are many different ways that you can do it, and I love that you brought that up, so I appreciate it. All right, document number 4. We're going to Hawaii here. Remember that this is in times 1898. It looks like that Hawaii is being taken over by the United States and being annexed, and the Hawaiian Queen is trying to stop that. So again, when I read it, I kind of immediately went back to document 1 and put those together as here's another way of diplomatically approaching state expansion. But what did y'all see?
So I'll go first this time. I agree that this is a diplomatic example of resistance. So I don't have a lot more to say about that. I do think this is a place where Bill's use of like analysis of the language is really important, because there's some really interesting things you can pull out of Lilio Kalani's statement here. So for example, the fact that she is referring to taking of property without due process of the law, that really, that's very savvy resistance, because that's something that is very important to American concepts of liberty, and the right to property ownership is fundamental to American society. So it's diplomatic insofar as it's a letter, but I would say that these are sort of fighting words.
Definitely.
Yeah, and for me, I mean, it's exactly as Jody's already said. I mean, I look at the language here of how she's putting this together, even setting herself up as heir apparent, and then the proclaimed queen. I mean, she sets herself up as having status and something that she can, again, look right into the eyes of the president and of the national legislature and say, hey, this is the way things are. But I think also when I started looking at these, and I go back to what you said, Mason, about the jigsaw puzzle, I've read these documents getting prepared tonight probably about 5 or 6 times. And every time I read the documents, I come up with a new way of organizing the essay. And I come up with a different way of being able to kind of set things up. It's never been the same each time. I'm seeing something a little bit different in each document to be able to kind of organize. And so for like this one, I see the purpose and the audience kind of pulling together here, similar to documents 1 and 2, when we look at Prempeh and the Tongak in Korea. If we start looking at those, they all kind of have a similar purpose and what they want to hope to achieve, but also maybe their audience. They're writing as much to other people as they're writing to their own people, and trying to get people to, follow along and rally together. And that's a resistance. Getting folks to rally together to resist this outward agency, I think, is a really important, that would be a really cool way of organizing these particular documents.
No, I agree. I think it's an excellent point. And again, there are so many different ways to do this. Of course, I know that the student struggle is, yes, there are a lot of ways to do it, but I have 45 minutes to write. Mm-hmm. So again, we understand that's a struggle. So if you need to kind of simplify some of this, and that's actually, I had that exact same struggle the first time I looked at this DBQ when I got to document 5. So let me just be honest. I received this DBQ. I started reading over the documents. The first 4, I was like, oh, I got this. We have military resistance. We have diplomatic channels. I was like, perfect. I've got my 2 categories. I got 2 documents to support it. I was set. And then I got to document 5. I was like, oh, wait a minute. I don't know if this fits in either of my categories. And I always kind of joke with my students, there's always this kind of one weird document that doesn't seem to fit an easy category that they throw in these DBQs. And I always tell them it's not, the College Board is not trying to mess with you. That's not what they're doing. But there is always kind of that one weird wonky document that you go, what do I do with this? So Bill and Jody, I guess I'll ask, what do you do when you get to that one document where you're like, I don't know if this really fits anything I've been planning, because I don't want to have to go back and rewrite everything I've done so far. You obviously don't want to do that. So what do you do when you get to this document?
I think this is where, again, the writing process might help you to arrive at a solution. So what I would do is I would try to summarize what's happening in the document. I would address it, right? And try and summarize what's happening, who's writing it, who are they writing it to? And just in doing that, you might find yourself with a place where it fits. And then you haven't lost time, you haven't, gotten off track. You might wait to address it at the end if it's really, really challenging you, if this really challenged you. To me, I'll push back a little bit on this being
that's fair.
document. I think that what you have here is, again, something where if you describe what's going on, so I'll just use what you have provided the students here, which is that this is a source that's coming from an aristocratic woman in Java. And that she is clearly showing us that the Dutch look down on the people of Java, but she's also saying some other things. She's saying the Dutch don't really understand us. And they're asking us to do something which we find problematic, and I'll use your language here, kind of weird. Like, we would do this for our family. We would do this for people that we truly respect, and as part of a very important ritual for something within our own culture and norms. But it's strange for us to have to do this to a stranger, because that's not what this ritual is about. This is a ritual that's very important and intimate to us and to our culture and our way of living. So they're pushing back. They're kind of pointing to the Dutch ignorance, actually. So while the Dutch might look down on them, she's also looking down on the Dutch, I think, in this argument. So then you have this tension. You have a description, I think, of Javanese people being diplomatic, right? So if you meet a stranger and they make some assumptions about you, and, you know, I'm from the Midwest, we're very nice people. So we'll kind of, you know, we play along to be diplomatic. So I think that's what you have going on here, that people say, okay, you're insisting on this. We don't want trouble. We, you know, we'll go ahead with this ritual, even though we think it's wrong. But you also have to know that a really important way of resisting things and history is by writing them down and making the observations themselves. So I kind of think of this as a resistance document. So the author herself is the person who's resisting, and she's resisting by recording what she saw as sort of a humiliating demonstration of Dutch arrogance and ignorance. That's what I see.
Yeah. So and I think, yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, that's okay. So I mean, I know, like, and honestly, that I do have a PhD in history, so it might come to me like really quickly again, that like I practice this a lot. But I would say that if you start again just describing what's happening there, you might get to the point where you realize, okay, she's describing something that fits in my diplomacy category, just not nicely.
Yeah, and you're exactly right. I love this document, first off, and I love your description of it as well. You know, it's like, yeah, they're kind of almost laughing about the Dutch behind their back, and I think it's great. There's the tension both ways there. I just had the problem of like, crud, I outlined my whole essay, and this just doesn't fit. You know.
Sure.
But you're right that if you can write about it at the end, save yourself a little time to be able to do that at the end, that'll still work. You can still receive credit that way as well. And remember, you know, everybody, you're going to get 5 documents. You have to use 4 of them to support your argument to get those 2 points, but still try all 5 at least.
Yeah. Because
as we said before, if you mess up on one, if you've done all 5, that's okay, because you're still going to get credit for doing 4 correctly. We are running out of time here, so I want to kind of move along real quick. We've talked about evidence beyond the documents a lot over the last couple of weeks, so I don't know if there's a whole lot to share here. But guys, just remember, yes, you can use your notes. Yes, you can use your textbook. But I would be really careful with that. Again, you're not going to have a lot of time. You need to kind of move it along. You don't have time to go flipping through all of your notes from the year. But the biggest thing I want to, keep harping on is just make sure you're being as specific as possible. So if you saw what I put here, European countries spread their empires everywhere. Okay, well, no, first off, that's just simply not true. Secondly, it's not extremely relevant to what we're talking about here in the prompt, and it's just not specific. Make sure your evidence beyond the document has some proper names, has some people, events, places, things like that. Bill, Jody, did y'all want to add something to that for evidence beyond the document?
Well, for me, Mason, the evidence beyond the document, I know a lot of people see it as being problematic, but it's just another piece of evidence. This one is coming out of the ether. It's coming out of your understanding and your knowledge of what's going on. You could use it as just another separate piece of evidence. You can have 2 documents that you've talked about and used as evidence to support your argument, and then you provide a separate piece of evidence that comes out that helps build that argument. One other way of being able to do that, as for example, you have down here with the Boxer Rebellion and the Chinese resistance to European and Japanese expansion, seems like it would fit really well with the Korean document that we had earlier. And that's just another piece of evidence that you're using in there. You could also use evidence beyond the document to provide historical situation for some of the documents and give some background knowledge. And these are some of the things that I know of. So again, the document doesn't necessarily talk about Neo-Confucianism, but if you were to talk about Neo-Confucianism, you could easily get in some additional information beyond the documents that helps explain what your argument is. Again, it's got to be connected back to the prompt in your argument.
Yeah, excellent point. I'm sorry, we're starting to run out of time here, so if we can move on to the last part. And Jody, I would like to get your thoughts on the complexity point, because this is a point that gets talked about a lot. The floor is kind of yours, though. What would you suggest for students as a way to possibly get this point in this DBQ? What are ways that they could do it?
So I think I've made several references to my favorite way that students can get this point, which is really the first one there, which is explaining the nuance of an issue by explaining multiple variables. So really digging into those documents, being able to draw out specific parts of them to show that you understand a deeper meaning behind the words is great. Really understanding, for example, and we're intentional that the documents that we provide you are a spectrum of positions on the prompt. And there's a wide range from maybe your very straightforward diplomatic message to the more complex observation of a diplomatic gesture, to a picture of a battle and a letter urging your comrades on to fight, right? So there's this nuance of perspectives that's happening, nuance of approaches to resistance, and a student who can really dig deep and find that nuance is great. But there's other places, you've got your showing us both, the continuities and changes. So you've set up a similarity and difference argument, but helping us to understand the causation deeply would be great. So I guess, you can definitely use any of these recommended ways of getting to complexity. The one that I want to caution people about is this making insightful connections within and across periods. Sometimes those connections that you make, because of the time constraints, don't end up coming across as being like maybe complex enough in order to get this point. So just making a brief reference to one of these things is not going to be enough. Saying, it's Cinco de Mayo today, so making a connection to the Battle of Puebla, for example, as part of this essay. There would be some insight there that you could make, but we'd want to make sure that you actually really understood what was like that, because this is really a question about indigenous responses to state expansion. So do you understand what the actual context and the actions were of that particular battle to make a comparison to maybe the image that you were evaluating? So there's so many ways to do this, but I think the more you can tell us what you know, the more likely you are to get this point, because you're going to do great.
Yeah. Excellent point. Excellent point. Well, we're kind of coming to the end here, so I just want to give y'all both a second. Any last minute thoughts? Anything you want to say to the students out there that are listening?
I think I'd like to go back to what we talked about at the very beginning, is that the readers, the people that are in at the reading now digitally, are doing what they can to make sure that you get the fairest, best read possible. We're there for you. You just need to provide us enough stuff to be able to give you scores. So go for the points. there's nothing holding you back at this. You just got to get in there and go for the points. Do as many things as you can to get all the points available, and we'll do what we can to get you there.
Yeah, I agree with Bill. I just want to encourage you to show us what you know. That's what we're looking for. You know, get the answer down, hit submit. I want to recognize students for all the sacrifices they're making right now. You know, this is a difficult time, and those of you who are seniors are missing lots of really important events. And so we've tried to make this year's exam as successful as we can, because we really appreciate how hard you've been working to prepare for the exam, and we look forward to this. We're nerds. We can't wait to see what you're going to do with these questions that we've been thinking about. I also have one other shout out, which is that it's Teacher Appreciation Week. So I would be remiss if I didn't mention my appreciation for all the AP World History teachers out there, especially Bill and Mason, and all the teachers who work with me to make the read really successful. It's the best part of doing the work that we do, is being able to be together and to share our ideas about what we're passionate about. So, you know, a special shout out to South Point, my high school, my alma mater in Tucson, Arizona, to your great teachers. You know, they're the people who got me where I am now. So I really appreciate all of you.
Thanks, Jody.
Well, thank y'all so much. I know y'all are really busy right now trying to get prepared for the reading and trying to finish up semesters at your schools both. So I know it's been really a crazy time, but really appreciate y'all coming on and helping give some more input and insight into the DBQ and what looks like the reading. So I know I appreciate it. I know students across the country do as well. So thank y'all so much.
No, thank
Thanks,
you.
Mason.
It's fun.
And just remember, for you guys out there, tomorrow Smith is going to be here. He's going to give you all another DBQ to practice with. And then on Thursday, he's going to go over it. And I think, Jody, you'll be here, right?
Mhm.
On Thursday, but with another special guest this time. So you'll have to tune in on Thursday to see that. All right. Good night, everybody. See y'all later.
Bye.
Bye.